Paul Atreides is one of the key figures in the universe created by Frank Herbert and expanded upon by his son Brian. If you look closely, the story of Muad'Dib lies right in the middle between humanity's expansion into space and the foretold arrival of the Khrazilek, or almost in the middle. The son of an influential duke, a mentat, the Kwisatz Haderach, born ahead of his time, a prophet and the hope of a harsh people from a terrifying world, an emperor famed for his bloody religious wars, a blind preacher, fiercely tearing the veil of divinity from himself. How did a young man, raised in wealth and care, manage not to soften in spirit and to walk a path that had been predetermined for him? And at what moment did the weight of that path finally break him? We will search for the answers to these questions together in the true story of Paul Muad'Dib, the Mahdi from the deadly deserts. The members of the great house Atreides claimed their lineage traces back to the ancient Greek king Atreus. This Atreus was the father of the much-suffering Agamemnon from the Iliad. Thus, the Atreides attempt to justify their claim to power in the Galactic Empire. Somewhat amusing are the efforts to add antiquity to their line in deep space, when not even memories remain of old Earth, don't you think? It is possible to trace the genealogy of House Atreides back to the titan Agamemnon, whose biological son, Vorian Atreides, was one of the most renowned warriors of the Butlerian jihad. After the establishment of the Carino dynasty, House Atreides became part of the Landsraad, the Council of Great Houses. For many centuries, the Atreides held significant political influence in the empire and a substantial share in the company responsible for spice extraction on Arrakis. The gene pool of House Atreides caught the attention of the sorceresses from Rossack, when it became one of the targets of the Scourge of Omnius, a virus released by the thinking machines to wipe out humans. Later, once the virus had been defeated, members of this great house played an important role in the genetic program of the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood. This program no longer had anything to do with preserving valuable genetic material. In their breeding program, the Bene Gesserit, the spiritual heirs of the Rossack witches, pursued entirely different goals. For centuries, the Bene Gesserit crossbred members of the great houses in a specific sequence to produce a man with the abilities of a reverend mother, one possessing the gift of prescience and genetic memory. The Kwisatz Haderach. This super being was supposed to lead lost society into a blissful future, naturally under the careful guidance of the Bene Gesserit sisters. To facilitate the Kwisatz Haderach's ascent to the highest ranks of power, the Bene Gesserit deployed their agents throughout the known universe. The purpose of these sisters was to plant religious beliefs containing a prophecy about a messiah who would save humanity from extinction. This part of the sisters' mission was called the Missionaria Protectiva. The mystical teachings took root especially well in harsh, inhospitable worlds, including Arrakis. If the Bene Gesserit's calculations had fully succeeded, the sisters would have gained control over a man of superintelligence, millions of fanatical armies, and the power to control the distribution of spice. That last point alone was worth fighting for. After all, he who controls the spice controls the universe. The elegant plan of the wise sisters failed precisely with the Atreides. How the Bene Gesserit intended to unite two fiercely feuding great houses through dynastic marriage remains unknown. In the end, everything was undone by one disobedient sister who had the audacity to fall in love with her master. The heir of the last duke, later the first Atreides, Paul, was born on Caladan, where his ancestors had ruled for 26 generations as Citadar governors. In the feudal empire, the Atreides managed to build a progressive society on their planet. Loyalty was highly valued, and the oppression of the population had an enlightened character. In a sense, the social structure of the Atreides might even be compared to that of classical ancient Greece. The planet itself resembled paradise. The ruling dynasty cared for the nature of its fiefdom, unwilling to repeat the mistakes of their sworn enemies, the Harkonnens. These managed to turn their homeworld, Giri Prime, into a world completely polluted by industrial waste. But one should not emulate the Fremen of Arrakis and assume that the warriors and members of House Atreides from the paradise like Caladan were soft and moist. Duke Atreides commanded an excellent army. His well-trained soldiers were led by renowned swordmasters, and strategy and tactics were handled by mentats. A well-trained human computer could easily replace an entire military council. And while mentats could not foresee the future, their information processing abilities allowed them to calculate it with incredible accuracy. When the Duke's beloved concubine, Lady Jessica, defied the will of her order and bore a son instead of a daughter, all the house's tutors were made available to the boy. He was trained in combat by the finest masters, and as he grew, his father discovered exceptional intellectual capabilities in his son. Paul Atreides began training as a mentat. According to Duke Leto, a ruler mentat was a powerful asset for strengthening the family's position on the political stage. His mother, aware of her son's special nature, simultaneously trained Paul in the ways of the Bene Gesserit, secretly hoping he was the Kwisatz Haderach. The boy learned to control his body and mind, and to influence the minds of others using special hypnotic techniques. From time to time, young Paul experienced dreams that might well have been prophetic. The presence of the gift of foresight would have convinced Lady Jessica and the Bene Gesserit that the product of their breeding program had been born one generation early. But on Caladan, these visions were fragmented and chaotic. While the heir was growing and learning in comfort, Duke Atreides carried out several political maneuvers that made him unwelcome to the ruling imperial house. Fearing the growing influence of the Atreides in the Landsraad, Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV entered into a secret conspiracy with Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. The goal was to lure the inconveniently powerful Duke into a trap. To that end, Shaddam transferred control of Arrakis, a desert planet where the Empire's greatest treasure, spice, was mined, to the Atreides. Duke Leto Atreides was forced to relocate his residence from the paradise of Caladan to a true hell. Before departing for Arrakis, a delegation of Bene Gesserit arrived to see the Atreides, led by the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam. The purpose of their visit was to conduct a test. The subject was the Duke's heir, Paul Atreides. The Bene Gesserit conducted such tests on their sisters to determine the subject's level of humanity. Under threat of a deadly poison needle, the Gom Jabbar, Paul was forced to endure the illusion of torture accompanied by inhuman pain. The young Duke endured the test with honor, lasting much longer than the Reverend Mother had expected. But did he earn recognition in the eyes of the high-ranking witch? Alas, Gaius Helen Mohiam, better than anyone, knew all the aspects of Paul's origin. She was not looking for humanity in the boy. In the potential Kwisatz Haderach, she was searching for signs of abomination, which would have been a death sentence for the prematurely born child. However, the Reverend Mother found nothing unusual in Paul Atreides, except for his selfless endurance, nor did she find any evidence that the boy was the Kwisatz Haderach. Empty-handed, the Bene Gesserit delegation departed Caladan. The Atreides family, along with their army, children, and retainers, departed for the deadly world of Arrakis. Practically immediately upon their arrival on DUNE, the Atreides began to face various accidents, strange malfunctions of spice harvesting equipment, mass resignations of workers involved in mining, a residence in Arrakeen laced with traps. What's more, Duke Leto's governing style, being used to caring for the people under his charge, only aroused suspicion among the locals. The only one who appeared somewhat loyal was the imperial planetologist Liet Kynes, who acted as the judge of the change. Paul Atreides was personally targeted almost immediately after arrival. Only his years of training saved him from falling victim to a hunter-seeker. Interestingly, this cunning, remote-control device was part of the arsenal of the Imperial Sardaukar. That should have been a warning sign. Duke Leto, his advisors, his Bene Gesserit concubine, and even his young heir all understood that a grand trap awaited them on Arrakis. Paul's training was expanded to include desert survival. He learned to use the special stillsuit and gear needed for travel in open terrain. Stimulated by the ever-present spice, Paul's mentat abilities also developed rapidly. Unfortunately, neither the wise advisors nor the son with the makings of a Kwisatz Haderach were able to foresee the betrayal of the doctor who had trained at the Suk Imperial School. It was believed that graduates of this institution were physically incapable of harming those they served. Baron Harkonnen managed to bypass the mental conditioning of the Suk school, and the Atreides family was left defenseless against an enemy from within. Driven by the hope of seeing his beloved wife again, Dr. Wellington Yue put the Duke and his household to sleep and lowered the shields. Paul and his mother Jessica were saved by the fact that Dr. Yue was not a traitor in the full sense. After handing Duke Leto over to Baron Harkonnen, he ensured that the Duke's son and concubine could escape. Thus, Paul Atreides and his mother ended up in the desert, the only place they could flee to from the Sardaukar-infested city of Arrakis. In helping Paul escape, the loyal servant of the house, Duncan Idaho, was killed. A little later, another Atreides ally also died, the planetologist Liet Kynes. Using all the knowledge he had acquired during his training, Paul managed to steer the ornithopter into the eye of a Coriolis storm and disappeared within it. The Harkonnen soldiers in Imperial Sardaukar were convinced that the Duke's son and concubine had perished. On Arrakis, the Harkonnen-appointed Glossu Raban once again took power. But what of Paul and Jessica? The heir of House Atreides and his mother did not wander the desert for long. Warned by Liet Kynes, the Fremen of C.H. Taber had already set out to find the fugitives. Duke Leto's policy, which aimed to win over the local population, bore some fruit. The desert dwellers of Arrakis, harsh warriors raised in conditions of severe water and food scarcity, accustomed to hardship and strict discipline, had long been underestimated by the Harkonnens, who never realized what power was hidden in the scattered strongholds of the desert. During their brief rule on Arrakis, Leto Atreides' people managed to establish contact with the Fremen, and that saved the life of the Duke's heir. Once in the desert, Paul sharply felt what Gaius Helen Mohiam had failed to see in him. The young Duke, immersed in calculations, realized that he was not merely a mentat. Like the guild navigators, he was capable of glimpsing the immediate future. This revelation nearly broke the young man. Only a strong sense of responsibility, instilled in him since childhood, and a thirst for vengeance against his treacherous enemies kept Paul from descending into madness. Despite the fact that some Fremen had already recognized Paul as their Lisan al-Gaib, a meeting with the desert dwellers on their own territory promised nothing good for outsiders. For the implant, made centuries ago by the Missionaria Protectiva to work, it was still necessary to prove to these people that the newcomers were indeed the ones they had been waiting for so long. A brief armed clash occurred between the search party from C.H. Taber and Paul and Jessica. All the desert dwellers' training proved powerless against the centuries-honed discipline of the Bene Gesserit. Mother and son achieved a bloodless victory, which made it all the more humiliating for the Fremen. There could have been no better proof for the desert people. Paul and Jessica were accepted as those who would lead the Fremen to a better future. For now, however, they were simply admitted into the tribe. Here, among the endless sands, Paul met the girl from his prophetic dreams, the love of his life. Here in the desert, Lady Jessica also received confirmation that her son was indeed the Kwisatz Haderach. The Fremen Naib Stilgar, in accepting the outsiders into the tribe, was guided not by superstition, but by purely practical considerations. He believed that two individuals trained in the full Bene Gesserit method would be useful to the CH. He made an agreement with Paul and Jessica that they would train the Fremen in their highly effective combat style. In addition, as a Bene Gesserit witch, Lady Jessica immediately became the CH's Sayadina, a kind of priestess. A Sayadina, even if not a formal leader, is surrounded with special honor among us. She teaches, she sustains the strength of God right here. Stilgar said to Lady Jessica. Paul, meanwhile, had to undergo another trial. One of the Fremen who had met them in the desert challenged him. He claimed that Paul was an upstart and that his victory in the desert was nothing but a fluke. Paul Atreides, a young and civilized man, did not wish to kill his opponent. However, the necessity of integrating into Fremen society left him no choice. By defeating Jameis, Paul proved his skill and his right to be among the Fremen. As a reward, he was given responsibility for the dead man's family. This custom came as a surprise to the young Duke, but he bore the trial with honor, accepting the wife and children of the Fremen he had slain into his own family. The secret tribal name, Usul, was given to him by the Naib after the duel. The official name Paul was to choose himself, and he did. Muad'Dib, a desert kangaroo mouse, agile and quick. The creature was perfectly adapted to life in the desert and was respected by the Fremen. Thanks to this episode, and partly due to his poor knowledge of the desert people's customs, Paul Atreides acquired a lawful wife after his victory over Janus. The newly named Muad'Dib did not know that giving a woman his water rings was equivalent to a marriage proposal. However, he would never regret the gesture, for he had proposed to the girl from his prophetic dreams. Soon, Paul would come to understand that the life of a Fremen was a continuous series of trials, each one with death as the cost of failure. The constant use of spice heightened Paul's prescient abilities, but Muad'Dib's visions remained vague. What frightened the young Duke most were the glimpses of millions marching across the universe under the Atreides banner in a bloody jihad, his name on their lips. And no matter how hard he tried to see more, the future slipped away from him. Struggling to find a way to prevent the terrible religious wars, Paul undertook a terrifying experiment. He decided to drink the water of life. No man had ever survived even a small dose of this poison. Paul Muad'Dib took just a single drop and fell into a death-like trance for several weeks. Some believed he had died, but Chani Kynes, as a Sayadina, brought her husband back to consciousness using water of life she herself had transformed. Upon awakening, Paul became the true Kwisatz Haderach, a man living in all times at once. The experience of ancestral memory and clear visions of the future overwhelmed him. Yet, in all this torrent of knowledge, Muad'Dib still found no way to prevent the jihad he so feared. Aside from mystical experiences, Paul Atreides also faced very earthly problems. For example, the renewed rule of the Harkonnens over Arrakis. Under orders from Baron Vladimir, Glossu Rabban was literally ravaging the planet, trying to squeeze every last drop from it. Another problem for the Fremen came in the form of the Imperial Sardaukar. Accustomed to easy victories, the Emperor's soldiers saw several defeats at the hands of the Fremen as an insult and resolved to annihilate the desert people. The desert dwellers expected that their newfound prophet would sweep away their enemies and lead them to paradise. Paul could no longer step away from this path, and at first, he didn't want to. The desire to avenge his father and all those who had died protecting him burned too strongly in him. The guerrilla war led by Muad'Dib on Arrakis nearly halted the spice shipments. If this had harmed only the Harkonnens, Paul Atreides might have remained merely the Desert Duke. But the cutoff from the most valuable substance in the universe provoked the wrath of the Landsraad and the Padishah Emperor himself. A massive fleet gathered in orbit over Arrakis to descend upon the rebellious Fremen. A Sardaukar detachment attacked a distant CH, where Paul's sister, Aliyah, and his son by Chani, Leto II, were hidden. As a result, Paul's son was killed, and Aliyah was taken prisoner. In a prophetic trance induced by the water of life, Paul saw the invading fleet. When Chani awakened him, he already knew that a great war was inevitable. Prophecies aside, it is people, not visions, who win wars. Whatever Paul's strange psychological state, his mentat mind and education allowed him to formulate a victorious strategy. It's unlikely the arriving emperor expected the wild local tribes to achieve victory and capture the supposedly secure city of Arrakeen. Shaddam had placed his faith in the Sardaukar and in defensive shields, but alas, by deploying the Atreides' ancestral atomics, Paul destroyed part of the mountain range that shielded Arrakeen from storms and sandworms. First, a Coriolis storm disabled the shields. Then, riders on sandworms stormed into the capital of Arrakis, and in open battle, without technological trickery, Paul's Fremen were stronger than the Emperor's Sardaukar. After sweeping away the Imperial army and defeating Baron Harkonnen's heir, Feyd-Rautha, in single combat, Paul Muad'Dib neutralized the Spacing Guild and the military forces of the Landsraad through simple blackmail. He merely had to threaten to destroy all the spice on the planet. The armies of the Great Houses withdrew. Emperor Shaddam IV was left alone with hordes of furious religious fanatics. Continuing to threaten the spice, Paul Muad'Dib forced the emperor to abdicate and go into exile on Seleucia Secundus. To ensure his ascension didn't appear to be a usurpation, Paul took the emperor's eldest daughter, Princess Irulan, as his wife. Checkmate. The Carino dynasty was replaced by the Atreides, exactly what Shaddam had tried to prevent by conspiring with Baron Vladimir. Emperor Paul Muad'Dib ruled for 12 years, and the most terrifying visions that the young duke's son had once tried to avoid came true, year after year. Only a few worlds, including Paul's home planet, Caladan, accepted the new emperor's rule unconditionally. The rest were flooded by a tide of fanatical Fremen warriors, armed with faith. The power of Muad'Dib, worshipped as a god on Arrakis, was imposed upon the known universe with fire and sword. The altered beliefs of the Zen Sunni faith spread across the galaxy, replacing secular authority with religious rule. However, the bloody methods used to enforce this new regime gradually stirred discontent. The transformation of religious philosophy to glorify Paul Muad'Dib as a divine figure sparked resistance among the more orthodox Fremen. These Fremen opposed not only the emperor's policies, but also his attempts to terraform Arrakis, transforming it from a lifeless desert into a habitable world. Plots flourished like yeast. Involved were the Bene Tlilax, known for their genetic experiments, the Bene Gesserit, whose breeding program had effectively been derailed by Paul's birth, and remains of House Carino, still scheming on Seleucia Secundus. Even within the emperor's own household, a conspirator lurked. Princess Irulan, desperate to bear Paul's child, joined the resistance. It was through her efforts that Chani was unable to conceive again. Irulan secretly added contraceptives to the concubine's food. Did Muad'Dib know? Yes, for the most part, he did. But in his prophetic visions, there were blind spots caused by the involvement of a guild navigator in the conspiracy. Using the prescient powers, the navigator essentially shielded the conspirators' plans from the emperor. In the end, the conspiracy partially succeeded. Paul was lured into a trap and subjected to a unique weapon, Stoneburner. The emperor was blinded. According to Fremen custom, he was now supposed to abdicate and walk into the desert. But the gift of prescience had not yet left Muad'Dib, and what he could no longer see with his eyes, visions revealed to him. Yet, the conspiracy had a second phase, one that touched Paul deeply. His beloved concubine, Chani, finally managed to conceive, but the birth of their child would cost her life. Paul was already swept up in the vortex of fate and could no longer step off the path, even knowing where it would lead. The Bene Tlilax conspirators believed Paul would try to bring his dead lover back. They miscalculated. The Gola Duncan, Idaho, placed near Paul, was intended to assassinate the emperor, but instead regain the memories of the original. His loyalty to House Atreides prevented him from carrying out his programmed mission. Yet, the Bene Tlilax had foreseen even that, and so the face dancer, Sightale, disguised as a Fremen girl and lurking at the imperial court, resorted to direct threats against the newborns. The face dancer did not know that Paul had long been aware of what he was. Still, the threat to kill the emperor's children immediately after birth seemed to the conspirators a guaranteed victory. And again, they miscalculated. Perhaps the blind Muad'Dib, now without the ability to foresee the future, would have been powerless against the assassin. But the children born of Chani were pre-born. This occurred because, before and during the pregnancy, the emperor's beloved had consumed large amounts of spice. By merging minds with his newborn son, Paul was able to kill Sightale and save his heirs. This was the final act of Paul Atreides as Emperor of the known universe. Afterward, blind and having lost the gift of prescience, he left the CH and walked into the desert to surrender himself to the will of Shai Hulud. Such was the custom of all Fremen who lost their sight, for the good of the tribe came above all. Emperor Paul Muad'Dib disappeared, For many years, his sister Aliyah, the abomination of heaven, ruled in his name. Her power was built on the deification of both her brother and herself. Officially, she was the regent for the emperor's children, Leto II and Ghanima Atreides. But the preborn Aliyah was unable to cope with the millions of ancestral voices in her mind and made a terrible pact with her grandfather, Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. He managed to silence the other voices and seized control of Aliyah's mind entirely. The bloody jihad in Paul's name continued. Terraforming of Arrakis also proceeded at full speed. More and more open water appeared on the planet, and the number of sandworms, the source of spice, diminished. Customs from the wet planets crept into Fremen life. Deep in the desert, resistance was forming, rejecting this new way of life. And then, the preacher appeared on the streets of Arrakeen. He spoke to the people, denounced the abomination in Aliyah, and openly criticized the cult that worshipped Muad'Dib. People listened to him, and many began to feel that Paul Muad'Dib himself had returned. Aliyah's religious authorities could do nothing about the preacher, and Aliyah herself also suspected that the blind man was her brother, who had survived in the desert. Young Leto II came to the same conclusion. After an attempted assassination, he escaped Aliyah's control and ventured into the desert in search of the ancient CH and the preacher. He found them, but the local Fremen had been bribed by his aunt. Realizing he could not escape the clutches of Aliyah's henchmen on his own, the preacher revealed his identity to his son. Together they launched a new guerrilla war, destroying canals and releasing water into the sand. They traveled across DUNE and eventually returned to Arrakeen. During his final sermon, the prophet Paul Muad'Dib was killed. He was slain by priests fanatically loyal to Aliyah. But Aliyah herself managed to break free from the influence of the dead Baron Harkonnen and ended her spiraling life. Leto II Atreides ascended the throne, soon to become a god. And Paul Muad'Dib, the father who could not bring himself to walk the golden path, forever lived on in the mind of his heir. The story of Paul Atreides, the Kwisatz Haderach born out of order, could serve as a cautionary tale for all who, within the Empire, dared to play with genes and human destinies. Even a mind as powerful as Paul Muad'Dib's cannot contain the living memory of countless generations without being doomed to a torturous end. A government founded on the fanatical worship of a ruler as a deity inevitably decays, and throughout history, artificial imposition of faith has always flooded the world with rivers of blood. In just 12 years, Paul Atreides transformed from a wise and just ruler into a blood-soaked tyrant. The greatest tragedy of Muad'Dib was that his actions were meant to prevent even greater bloodshed. But how does one measure the evil in one's own deeds? For Emperor Paul, it was beyond his ability, and the blind preacher could no longer change what had been done. And that's all from me. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell. Your support is the best reward for me. Thank you for watching. See you soon. Goodbye.